Objective number 3. Use an industrial organization or I/O model to explain how firms can earn above average returns. The I/O or industrial organization model adopts an external perspective to explain that forces outside of the organization represent the dominant influences on a firm's strategic actions. In other words, this model presumes that the characteristics of and conditions present in the external environment determine the appropriateness of strategies that are formulated and implemented in order for a firm to earn above average returns. In short, the I/O model specifies that the choice of industries in which to compete has more influence on firm performance than decisions made by managers inside the firm. The I/O model is based on the following 4 assumptions. The external environment. The general industry competitive environments impose pressures and constraints on firms and determine strategies that will result in superior returns. In other words, the external environment pressures the firm to adopt strategies to meet that pressure while simultaneously constraining or limiting the scope of strategies that might be appropriate and eventually successful. 2. Most firms competing in an industry or in an industry segment control similar sets of strategically relevant resources and thus pursue similar strategies. This assumption presumes that given a similar availability of resources, most firms competing in a specific industry have similar capabilities and thus follow strategies that are similar. In other words, there are few significant differences among firms in an industry. 3. Resources used to implement strategies are highly mobile across firms. Significant differences in strategically relevant resources among firms in an industry tend to disappear because of resource mobility. Thus, any resource differences soon disappear as they are observed and acquired or learned by other firms in the industry. 4. Organizational decision makers are assumed to be rational and committed to acting only in the best interest of the firm. The implication of this assumption is that organizational decision makers will consistently exhibit profit-maximizing behaviors. According to the I/O model, which was a dominant paradigm from the 1960s through the 1980s, firms must pay careful attention to the structural characteristics of the industry in which they choose to compete, searching for one that is the most attractive to the firm, given the firm's strategically relevant resources. Then the firm must be able to successfully implement strategies required by the industry's characteristics to be able to increase the level of competitiveness. The 5 forces model is a well-known analytical tool used to address and describe these industry characteristics. We will discuss this in great detail in Chapter 2. Based on its 4 underlying assumptions, the I/O model prescribes a 5-step process for firms to achieve above-average returns. 1. Study the external environment, the general industry and competitive, to determine the characteristics of the external environment that will both determine and constrain the firm's strategic alternatives. 2. Locate an industry in which high potential for returns based on the structural characteristics of the industry. The 5 forces model of competition is a great tool for this analysis. 3. Based on the characteristics of the industry in which the firm chooses to compete, strategies that are linked with above-average returns should be selected. A model or framework that can be used to assess the requirements and risk of these strategies, like the generic strategies called cost, leadership, or differentiation, are discussed in detail in Chapter 4. 4. Acquire and develop the critical resources, skills, and assets needed to successfully implement the strategy that has been selected. A process for scrutinizing the internal environment to identify the presence or absence of critical skills is discussed in Chapter 3. Skill enhancement strategies, including training and development, are discussed in Chapter 11. 5. The I/O model indicates that above-average returns will accrue to firms that successfully implement relevant strategic actions that enable the firm to leverage its strengths to meet the demands or pressures and constraints of the industry in which it has elected to compete. The implementation process is described in Chapters 10 through 13. The I/O model has been supported by research indicating 20% of firm profitability can be explained by industry characteristics, 36% of firm profitability can be attributed to firm characteristics and the actions taken by the firm. Overall, this indicates a reciprocal relationship or even an interrelationship between industry characteristics and firm strategies that result in firm performance.